Throughout railroad history, brilliant engineers pushed the boundaries of what locomotives could do. Some innovations worked spectacularly. Others proved so dangerous, impractical, or terrifying that governments stepped in to ban them outright. Today, we're exploring 20 locomotive technologies that were simply too far ahead of their time. Let's begin. Isambard Kingdom Brunel proposed an atmospheric railway for the South Devon Line in 1844. Trains would be propelled by vacuum pressure through an iron tube running between the rails. A piston beneath each carriage connected through a leather flap valve, and stationary pumping engines every 3 miles would pull trains at unprecedented speeds. On paper, it was pure genius. In practice, a disaster of almost comical proportions. The leather valve running the entire length of track needed to remain perfectly airtight, but nobody had considered what happens to leather exposed to English weather. Rain rotted it thoroughly, sun dried it out, and cracked it beyond any repair. Then came the rats. Thousands discovered the tallow grease keeping the leather supple was absolutely delicious. They ate the valve seals for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Within months, the entire system leaked like a sieve. Brunel spent fortunes replacing leather sections, but the rats returned hungrily for more. By 1848, the South Devon Atmospheric Railway was abandoned after burning through £40 million in modern money. In 1870, Alfred Beach secretly constructed a pneumatic subway beneath Broadway in New York. A massive fan called the Western Tornado pushed cylindrical passenger cars through an airtight tunnel using air pressure alone. Beach built his demonstration tunnel in 58 nights, working only after dark to avoid corrupt Boss Tweed's political interference. The results seemed miraculous to amazed passengers, but the technology concealed fatal limitations. System required perfectly sealed tunnels, and any breach meant complete loss of propulsion. Fire posed extraordinary danger as passengers trapped in airtight tunnels had no escape route and no breathable air. The single fan could only move 1 car at a time, making expansion impossibly expensive. Most damning, New York winters froze moisture in the compressed air, paralyzing mechanisms completely. Municipal authorities refused to approve pneumatic transit for passenger service after Beach's tunnel closed. London experimented with pneumatic mail tubes, but banned passenger applications entirely. Before electricity, railroads faced a terrifying choice: travel in darkness or risk fiery death. Most chose fire, installing coal gas lighting that turned every passenger car into a potential bomb. The Pinch system stored compressed coal gas in cylinders beneath cars, feeding ornate ceiling fixtures that provided adequate illumination for reading. The problem was obvious to everyone, except railroad accountants counting pennies. Compressed coal gas mixed with air creates explosive atmospheres that any spark can ignite. Every derailment, every collision, carried the possibility of catastrophic explosion, followed by inferno. Between 1880 and 1910, gas-lit cars caused hundreds of fatalities in post-collision fires. The 1887 Chatsworth disaster killed 82 when derailed cars' gas systems ruptured and ignited, burning bodies beyond recognition. State commissions began mandating electric lighting in the 1900s. Sudden movements pitched people into wheels below. Children found gaps irresistible and fell through regularly. Conductors slipped and died beneath wheels with depressing regularity. George Pullman developed the enclosed vestibule in 1887, creating protected passageways between cars. Railroad companies resisted because vestibules added cost. They argued passengers died through carelessness, not design flaws. Massachusetts banned open platform construction in 1893. Other states followed. The Safety Appliance Act of 1893 mandated secure handholds but didn't specifically require vestibules. Full enclosed vestibule requirements came through state railroad commissions with open platforms. Banned from mainline service by the early 1900s, the idea of crossing between cars across open gaps above spinning wheels now seems insane. For 30 years, it was simply how passengers traveled. In the 1920s, Railroad engineers had a brilliant idea. Instead of shoveling coal lumps into fireboxes, pulverize coal into fine dust and blow it in like fuel oil. Combustion would be more complete, efficiency would skyrocket, and firemen wouldn't need ironbacks. Several railroads experimented enthusiastically. Then the explosions began. Pulverized coal suspended in air doesn't just burn. Under right conditions, it detonates with the force of dynamite. Coal dust explosions had killed thousands in mines for decades, but engineers somehow thought locomotive fireboxes would be different. They weren't. The problem was ignition timing. Coal dust needs perfect air-fuel mixture and precise ignition. Too rich or lean, unburned dust accumulates until reaching critical concentration. Then something triggers ignition, accumulated dust explodes simultaneously, and the firebox becomes a bomb. The Pennsylvania Railroad's experimental coal dust locomotive suffered catastrophic explosion during testing. The Interstate Commerce Commission recommended against the technology in 1928. By 1930, every major railroad had abandoned coal dust firing. The technology worked beautifully in controlled power plants, but proved impossibly dangerous in the violent world of locomotives. The Fireless locomotive seemed perfect for industrial applications where smoke and sparks posed unacceptable risks. Chemical plants, textile mills, and ammunition factories needed switching power but couldn't tolerate open flames. These locomotives carried no firebox. An oversized boiler was charged with superheated water and steam from stationary sources. Pressure differential powered the engine until stored energy depleted. The concept worked within severe limitations. A fully charged fireless locomotive could operate roughly 2 to 4 hours before needing recharge, limiting range to perhaps 5 miles under load. Efficiency dropped catastrophically as boiler pressure declined. Winter operations were particularly problematic as heat loss accelerated dramatically. Mainline commissions banned fireless locomotives from interchange service because they couldn't maintain schedules or operate beyond charging stations. The Federal Railroad Administration never certified any fireless design for common carrier operation. They remained confined to industrial switching. Today, surviving examples sit in museums as curiosities, representing an engineering compromise that solved specific problems while creating others too significant for wider adoption. Thomas Edison predicted battery-powered locomotives would revolutionize railroads. He spent years developing storage batteries, specifically for railroad traction. Other inventors followed, convinced silent electric power would replace smoky steam. They were all decades too early. The problem was energy density. Steam locomotives convert chemical energy from coal with brutal simplicity. Battery locomotives must carry the weight of their energy storage, which meant lead-acid cells weighing tons per hour of operation. The numbers never worked. Kennecott Copper operated battery locomotives in Alaska mines starting in 1928, but routes measured in hundreds of feet, not miles. Several railroads tested battery yard switches. Results were uniformly discouraging. The heaviest practical battery locomotive could operate perhaps 15 miles before requiring hours of recharging. Performance declined as batteries discharged. Winter weather reduced range by half. The Interstate Commerce Commission set interchange standards requiring minimum distances between servicing. Battery locomotives couldn't meet these standards outside tiny industrial operations. The technology banned itself through physics rather than legislation. Performance declined as batteries discharged. Winter weather reduced range by half. The Interstate Commerce Commission set interchange standards requiring minimum distances between servicing. Battery locomotives couldn't meet these standards outside tiny industrial operations. The technology banned itself through physics rather than legislation. The Sentinel steam rail car represented British engineering at its most stubborn. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Sentinel Wagon Works produced self-propelled railway vehicles powered by compact vertical boilers. These railcars promised economical branch line service without full locomotive expense. They delivered instead a maintenance nightmare. Vertical boiler design placed enormous stress on crown sheets, the critical plates separating water from fire. Conventional horizontal boilers keep crown sheets safely submerged even when water levels drop slightly. Vertical boilers leave crown sheets vulnerable whenever water level falls during acceleration, braking, or grade changes. Exposed crown sheets overheat catastrophically, potentially triggering explosions. British railway inspectors documented multiple crown sheet failures in Sentinel rail cars throughout the 1930s. The Ministry of Transport imposed increasingly stringent restrictions, eventually requiring inspections after every run. Costs soared beyond viability. By 1940, most operators had withdrawn Sentinel equipment. Post-war nationalisation included unofficial prohibition of new vertical boiler railcar construction. The technology faded from British rails by the 1950s. Shea, Heisler and Climax geared locomotives were engineering marvels for logging railroads and mountain mining, where tight curves and steep grades made conventional rod locomotives impractical. Their geared drive delivered enormous tractive effort at walking speeds across terrain that would derail anything else. Naturally, ambitious engineers wanted to use them everywhere. They couldn't. The same gearing that gave superhuman pulling power on mountain switchbacks made them hopelessly slow on level track. A typical Shea topped out around 12 miles per hour. Mainline schedules demanded speeds 3 or 4 times faster. Mechanical complexity of geared drive created maintenance nightmares at higher speeds, as universal joints and gear trains wore rapidly under stress never intended. The Interstate Commerce Commission established minimum speed standards for interchange that effectively excluded geared locomotives. Railroad operating rules prohibited equipment incapable of maintaining schedules from mainline track. These regulations didn't ban geared locomotives explicitly, but created requirements they couldn't meet. The machines remained confined to original domains, doing extraordinary work on impossible terrain. In 1954, Dr. Lyle Borst of the University of Utah proposed the X-12, a nuclear-powered locomotive that would revolutionize American railroading. A small reactor would generate steam for turbines, providing essentially unlimited range. The railroad industry commissioned feasibility studies. What they found killed the dream permanently. Shielding required to protect crew and public from radiation would weigh several hundred tons, creating a locomotive so massive it would crush standard rail. Reactor containment couldn't survive the impacts and derailments that working locomotives inevitably experienced. A nuclear accident on a main line would irradiate entire communities. Estimated cost exceeded $1 million when diesels cost $60,000. The Atomic Energy Commission quietly declined to pursue railroad reactors. No formal ban was necessary because no technology existed that could make nuclear locomotives practical or safe. The concept joined cold fusion and perpetual motion as ideas that sound revolutionary until engineers examine actual requirements. Dr. Borst's proposal gathered dust, while diesel locomotives proved perfectly adequate. Sometimes the most advanced technology is simply the wrong solution. Stove-heated passenger cars turned every derailment into a potential crematorium. Before steam heat became standard in the 1890s, railroads warmed coaches with wood and coal stoves placed directly inside wooden cars. The arrangement worked well enough on smooth runs, but in any collision or derailment, these cast iron furnaces would overturn and dump burning coals across flammable wooden floors. The Angola horror of 1867 demonstrated the consequences with devastating clarity. When a New York express derailed near Angola, New York, overturned stoves ignited the wooden wreckage with passengers trapped inside. 49 people burned to death while rescuers listened helplessly to their screams. The Ashtabula disaster of 1876 proved even worse. 92 passengers died when 11 cars plunged through a collapsed bridge and stove fires consumed the wreckage in a frozen ravine. Survivors described scenes from hell, burning passengers leaping from windows into snowdrifts, their clothing aflame. Railroad executives resisted change because steam heating systems cost money. They calculated that occasional passenger immolations were acceptable business expenses compared to infrastructure investment. Journal boxes without proper lubrication systems killed locomotives through mechanical failure disguised as fire. Every railroad car rode on axles supported by brass journal bearings, and these bearings required constant lubrication from oil-soaked waste packing. When the grease ran out or waste packing dried up, metal ground against metal at tremendous speed. The friction generated enough heat to ignite the wooden bearing housings and then the car itself. Railroaders called this catastrophe a hot box, and experienced crews could smell burning packing before flames erupted. But early detection only worked if someone was watching that specific axle. Night runs and distracted crews meant hot boxes often burned unnoticed until entire cars were ablaze. The solution required better bearing design, improved lubrication systems, and eventually roller bearings that eliminated brass-on-steel contact entirely. But railroads resisted upgrading millions of existing freight cars because replacement cost money. Hotbox detectors, trackside sensors detecting overheated bearings, didn't become standard until the 1950s. For decades, the industry accepted that some percentage of cars would simply catch fire. Steam locomotives in tunnels created death traps that even experienced railroad crews couldn't survive. The confined spaces concentrated exhaust gases and blocked natural ventilation, turning every passage into a potential asphyxiation chamber where smoke accumulated faster than it could dissipate. The Park Avenue Tunnel in Manhattan became the most infamous example of this deadly combination. On January 8, 1902, dense smoke obscured all signals as a New York Central Express approached a stopped commuter train. Engineer John Whisker never saw the red lights through the choking smog that filled the tunnel from floor to ceiling. His locomotive plowed into the stationary coaches at speed, killing 15 passengers and injuring dozens more. The disaster forced immediate action from New York legislators. The state passed legislation banning steam locomotives from the Park Avenue tunnels by July 1908, triggering the massive electrification project that created Grand Central Terminal. The Baltimore Belt Line had already electrified in 1895, after crews regularly passed out from fumes. Steam had conquered the open country, but proved fundamentally incompatible with enclosed spaces. Timetable and train order operations left collision prevention entirely to human memory and paperwork, with predictably catastrophic results. Before automatic block signals, trains on single-track lines operated under a system of printed schedules and handwritten orders delivered by telegraph. Engineers memorized which trains they would meet and where, trusting that opposing crews had received identical instructions from distant dispatchers. The margin for error was essentially zero. A misremembered meet point, a garbled telegraph message, or a watch running slow meant head-on collision at combined speeds often exceeding 100 miles per hour. The Camp Hill disaster of 1856 killed over 60 children on a Sunday school excursion when train crews received conflicting orders about meeting points. Investigators discovered neither engineer had properly verified their instructions before departing the station. Automatic block signals eliminated the human factor by physically preventing trains from entering occupied track sections. Railroads resisted because signals cost money and implied their dispatchers were fallible. Thousands died while accountants debated whether safety was worth installation costs. Wooden passenger cars weren't formally banned, but were abandoned after decades of spectacular failures that made insurance nearly impossible to obtain. These elegantly crafted coaches, with their varnished exteriors and plush interiors, concealed a fundamental engineering flaw that killed thousands. Wood splintered on impact rather than absorbing energy, turning every collision into a shrapnel factory that killed passengers with fragments of their own, seats and walls. The Pennsylvania Railroad recognized this danger and committed to all-steel construction in 1906. Their new Hudson River Tunnel demanded fireproof equipment, but passenger safety also drove the decision. Steel cars telescoped less violently than wooden ones, where heavier locomotives would plow through trailing coaches, crushing everything and everyone inside. By 1908, the Interstate Commerce Commission reported that 6,000 passengers and 48,000 railroad workers had died in 19 years. Steel construction offered proven protection. By 1913, major American railroads ceased ordering wooden passenger equipment. Insurance companies and public pressure accomplished what legislation couldn't. The Kaufman Act of 1923 attempted to ban steam locomotives from all of New York City, not just the Park Avenue tunnel that had already been electrified. Sponsored by Assemblyman Victor Kaufman and signed by Governor Al Smith, this aggressive legislation mandated electrification of every railroad in the city by January 1926, with crushing penalties of $5,000 per day per violation. The railroads objected strenuously. Electrifying freight yards and industrial sidings cost far more than passenger terminals, and the impossible timeline gave them no options. Rather than electrify marginal operations, some railroads began experimenting with diesel-electric locomotives. The Central Railroad of New Jersey and Baltimore and Ohio both purchased early Alco box cab diesels specifically to comply with Kaufman requirements in their freight terminals. This created the initial market that eventually transformed American railroading completely. But the Kaufman Act itself didn't survive legal challenge. In 1926, Judge Learned Hand ruled it unconstitutional for interfering with interstate commerce. The law was repealed in 1930, but its brief existence had already sparked the diesel revolution. Camelback locomotives placed engineers directly above, the driving wheels in cabs straddling the boiler, a design that saved fuel but killed crew members with disturbing regularity. The configuration emerged from John Wooten's wide firebox design of 1877, which efficiently burned waste anthracite culm but required relocating the engineer forward of the massive fire grate. The fireman remained alone on an exposed rear platform, separated from the engineer by tons of boiler and deafening noise that made communication impossible. If anything went wrong during operation, neither crew member could help the other. The engineer perched directly over reciprocating rods that occasionally broke and flailed with lethal force through the cab floor above. Railroaders on the Baltimore and Ohio nicknamed certain classes snappers because broken side rods would snap upward through the cab without warning, killing or maiming whoever sat above. The Interstate Commerce Commission reportedly banned new camelback construction around 1927, though the exact regulatory history remains disputed by railroad scholars. Roughly 3,000 were built before the end, and survivors operated into the early 1950s. Handbrakes turned every freight train into a gauntlet of death for the men who operated them. Before air brakes became mandatory, stopping a train required brakemen to run across car rooftops at the engineer's whistle signal, manually turning brake wheels on each car in sequence while the train was still moving beneath their feet. In daylight, on dry days, this was merely dangerous. In rain, snow, or darkness, it was frequently fatal. Brakemen slipped from icy roofs, struck their heads on low bridges they couldn't see coming, and fell between cars with grinding wheels waiting below. Railroad employment records from the era show casualty rates rivaling combat infantry during wartime. The Safety Appliance Act of 1893 mandated automatic air brakes on all trains engaged in interstate commerce, but gave railroads until 1900 to comply. George Westinghouse had perfected the automatic air brake in 1872, proving the technology existed decades earlier. The industry simply preferred dead brakemen to expensive equipment upgrades. When the law finally took effect, coupling and braking casualties dropped by over 80% almost immediately. The rooftop brakeman became railroad history. Open locomotive cabs exposed crews to weather that killed as surely as any mechanical failure. Early steam locomotives offered engineers and firemen virtually no protection from wind, rain, snow, or flying debris that could strike with bullet-like force. Men worked 12-hour shifts in sub-zero temperatures, operating controls with frost-bitten hands, while ice formed on every metal surface they touched. Summer brought different tortures. Temperatures exceeding 140 degrees from firebox radiation, combined with scalding steam leaks, turned open cabs into infernos where heat stroke killed men at their posts. The lack of protection wasn't engineering oversight, but deliberate management policy. Railroad officials believed enclosed cabs made crews comfortable enough to sleep on duty. They feared warmth would reduce alertness, so they mandated suffering as a management tool. Engineers died from exposure, heat stroke, and flying debris because management trusted misery to maintain vigilance. Enclosed cabs became standard only after railroad brotherhoods organized and forced the issue through collective action. Legislation requiring crew protection passed state by state, often over fierce railroad opposition. Link and pin couplers stand as the deadliest technology ever permitted on American railroads, killing and maiming workers at industrial scale for 4 decades while legislators debated. The system required brakemen to stand between railroad cars during coupling operations, guiding a heavy iron link into position while dropping a pin to secure it. Perfect timing was essential. Hesitate by a fraction of a second and the closing cars would crush hands, arms, or entire bodies between the buffers. Railroaders could identify veteran brakemen by their missing fingers. In 1888 alone, 518 railroad workers died from coupling accidents.
Number 14. 16-hour shifts with minimal rest requirements. The Hours of Service Act of 1907 technically limited duty to 16 hours, but railroads pushed crews to their absolute limit on every run. Engineers would finish a grueling shift, grab a few hours of restless sleep in a trackside hotel, and climb back into the cab before dawn. Today's regulations cap continuous service at 12 hours. In the 1950s, a locomotive engineer thought nothing of running 16 consecutive hours through mountain grades and across endless prairie straightaways. The law contained so many loopholes that companies routinely scheduled back-to-back marathon runs with minimal rest between. Congress finally reduced the maximum to 14 hours in 1969, then to 12 hours in 1976 following fatigue-related accidents.
The theory was elegant. Steam would spin a turbine. Built by the North British Locomotive Company, this bizarre machine promised to revolutionize rail travel by eliminating the hammering forces of reciprocating pistons, was a mechanical nightmare. The electrical transmission system could not handle the stresses of railway operation.
With mandatory 10-hour rest periods, monthly maximums, and fatigue management plans that would have seemed impossibly strict to post-war railroaders, the Federal Railroad Administration can assess penalties exceeding $25,000 for a single hours of service violation.
Test runs revealed a machine that consumed coal at terrifying rates while producing barely adequate power. The condensing system, essential for turbine efficiency. Within months, the North British Locomotive Company quietly rebuilt the entire locomotive with conventional direct drive turbines, hoping to salvage something from the disaster.
The freewheeling approach to crew scheduling that defined the steam to diesel transition is now a federal crime. Steam locomotive crews in the 1950s had nothing to stop a train if the engineer became incapacitated. There was no alerter system, no dead man switch, and no automatic braking to detect an unresponsive operator at the throttle. If an engineer suffered a heart attack or fell asleep after 16 hours on duty, the train kept rolling until something stopped it, usually something catastrophic.
In 1933, Italian state railways decided to transform a perfectly good Class 685 locomotive. That attempt failed too. The rebuilt machine limped through a handful of tests before being abandoned entirely due to persistent mechanical failures.
Modern locomotives require alerter systems that demand periodic acknowledgement from the engineer, typically every 60 seconds during operation.
The turbine simply could not deliver power efficiently across the speed ranges that railway operation demanded. The boiler, designed for a reciprocating engine's intermittent steam demand, could not keep up with the turbine's constant appetite. Performance plummeted to levels well below the original piston-driven locomotive. The failed conversion stood as proof that bolting new technology onto old designs rarely ends well. Ross Winans built his first camel locomotives for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad starting in 1848.
Early diesel locomotives often lacked sanitary facilities as well, and the ones that existed were frequently inoperable due to maintenance neglect.
Engineers perched directly above the whirling side rods and main rods with nothing but thin cab walls between them and disaster. They simply refitted the locomotive with a conventional piston engine in 1936.
The Federal Railroad Administration (FRA) issued locomotive cab sanitation standards that took effect in 2002, requiring all road locomotives to have functioning toilet facilities that meet specific requirements. Engineers on 12-hour runs either developed exceptional bladder control or relied on creative solutions nobody discussed in polite company. A locomotive with an inoperable toilet can be cited for federal violations and removed from service until repairs are completed. The era of crews relieving themselves out of cab windows or into whatever container was handy is officially and legally over.
Despite these dangers, Winans built hundreds of camels, prioritizing fuel savings over human safety.
Older units have been retrofitted at considerable expense, and new locomotives cannot receive operating certificates without functioning alerters that meet current specifications.
The Pennsylvania Railroad's engineering department in the 1930s sketched designs for what would have been the most ambitious articulated locomotive ever conceived, that had already proven problematic on the Erie and Virginian railroads. Internal documents show engineers planning for over 200,000 pounds of tractive effort.
Old railroad hands tell stories of engineers tucking bottles into their grips for long overnight runs, of crews stopping at trackside taverns during extended layovers, of supervisors looking the other way as long as trains ran on time without major incidents. The culture tolerated moderate drinking in ways that would destroy careers today. A nip to ward off the cold during a winter run was practically expected in some territories. Random testing, post-accident testing, and reasonable suspicion testing became standard across the entire industry.
In an era when worker deaths were considered acceptable business expenses, an engineer suffering heat stroke might collapse while the oblivious fireman continued stoking coal.
That is different from the automobile driving limit of 0.08. Get caught with any measurable alcohol and you face immediate removal from service.
Frame structures could not be built strong enough to contain the articulation points without exceeding weight limits on every bridge in the system.
Look at any steam locomotive photograph from the 1950s and you will see a single headlight centered on the smoke box. No auxiliary lights, no ditch lights mounted low on the frame.
Pennsylvania Railroad engineers quietly shelved the proposal, recognizing that ambition had outpaced physics. Because even preliminary analysis revealed insurmountable problems, numbers that existed only in calculations. No boiler then conceivable could generate enough steam for 4 sets of cylinders operating simultaneously. Thermal stress calculations showed boiler plates warping under impossible demands.
Federal drug and alcohol testing regulations came into effect in 1985, transforming railroad employment forever.
Sometimes the most dangerous prototypes are the ones never built. The Chesapeake and Ohio M1 class arrived in 1947, looking like something from science fiction. Water from the condensing system followed the dust, turning coal residue into an abrasive slurry that destroyed electrical components.
Today, every locomotive operating over public grade crossings at speeds above 20 miles per hour must have functioning ditch lights that produce at least 200,000 candela. Canadian National Railway pioneered ditch lights in the 1960s, positioning low-mounted lights to create a distinctive triangle pattern with the main headlight visible from oblique angles. Diesels of the era followed the same minimal pattern with 1 or 2 headlights mounted high on the cab. This minimal lighting made locomotives nearly invisible at grade crossings until dangerously close, contributing to thousands of fatal highway rail collisions over the decades. Steam locomotives leaked radiant heat from every direction, turning summer runs into rolling saunas where cab temperatures exceeded 120 degrees. Winter meant the fireman's side baked from proximity to the firebox, while the engineer's side froze from poorly sealed windows. Early diesels improved somewhat, but air conditioning remained a luxury reserved for passenger service. Crews endured temperature extremes that modern safety standards recognize as dangerous. Heat exhaustion and hypothermia were accepted occupational hazards that crews simply endured as part of the job. All new and remanufactured locomotives must now have functioning air conditioning systems meeting specific performance standards. These climate control systems must be verified during every periodic locomotive inspection. A locomotive with an inoperable climate control unit faces federal citations and potential service removal. Number 8. Asbestos insulation everywhere. Every steam locomotive of the 1950s carried between 4,000 and 6,000 pounds of asbestos insulation wrapped around boilers, fireboxes, steam pipes, and cylinders. The mineral was perfect for the job, remarkably heat-resistant, extremely durable, and relatively inexpensive. Locomotive crews worked inches from this insulation every single shift.
Baldwin engineers traveled to Virginia hoping to solve the problems, but achieved nothing. This massive machine could barely sustain 5 miles per hour. The boiler, despite being larger than anything previously attempted, simply could not generate enough steam for 6 enormous cylinders operating simultaneously. After less than 5 years of frustrating service, the Virginian returned the locomotive to Baldwin.
Modern regulations classify asbestos as a known carcinogen. Removing it from vintage locomotives requires full hazardous materials protocols, sealed containment, and certified disposal. What crews once handled bare-handed is now treated as deadly contamination, requiring protective suits and respirators.
One early test run managed just 17 miles before the locomotive literally pulled a coupler clean out of a coal car. The Virginian Railway's Class XA was the only 28884 ever built, a triplex so ambitious it bordered on engineering fantasy.
Locomotives carried no recording devices, no data loggers, no electronic memory of their final moments. The engineer's throttle position, brake applications, and speed at impact died with the incident. The first train event recorders emerged in Europe in the late 1800s, but American railroads resisted the technology for decades. Cost was one factor, and Union concerns about surveillance were another. The Federal Railroad Administration finally mandated event recorders in 1995 for all trains operating above 30 miles per hour. A 2005 rule required crash-hardened memory modules capable of surviving fires, impacts, and complete immersion. Today's locomotives record over 20 data points, including speed, throttle position, brake pipe pressure, horn activation, and alerter acknowledgements. This data must be preserved for 1 year after any reportable incident. The 1950s practice of operating 1,000-ton trains without any permanent record is now a federal violation, subject to substantial penalties. These auxiliary lights must flash alternately when the horn sounds. Operating without them risks federal penalties and creates the kind of grade-crossing danger that killed thousands before modern visibility standards.
The locomotives could not complete a single journey from Washington to Cincinnati without suffering some kind of failure. After spending millions on development, the C&O operated their M1s for barely a year before giving up. All 3 were scrapped in 1950, having proven that coal and electrical equipment simply cannot coexist in the same machine.
The 1950s locomotive cab was built for crew access and forward visibility, not occupant survival. Thin sheet metal, minimal structural reinforcement, and large glass windows created cabs that crumpled like tin cans in crashes. Modern locomotives must withstand collisions with highway vehicles and with shifted freight loads. Collision posts must resist 500,000 pounds of static force. Anti-climbers prevent locomotives from riding over each other in head-on collisions. Wide-nose cabs built to these exacting standards have saved lives in accidents that would have killed crews in 1950s equipment. The thin-skinned cabs of the steam era are now prohibited. Number 5. 5-man crews with the caboose. In the 1950s, freight trains commonly carried 5 or 6 crew members: engineer, fireman, conductor, head brakeman, flagman, and sometimes a swing brakeman.
Turbines require high rotational speeds to operate efficiently, and gearing that worked beautifully at highway velocities proved catastrophic at yard speeds. Steaming proved so poor that the locomotive could not match the performance of standard Gresley Pacifics despite its advanced technology. The compound expansion system required constant adjustment. but the locomotive's problems proved impossible to hide. Nigel Gresley designed it with a water tube boiler operating at 450 pounds per square inch, more than double the pressure of conventional locomotives.
This labor-intensive operation reflected union contracts and the technological limitations of the era. Technology eliminated these positions one by one over subsequent decades.
Trains accelerate from stations, slow for curves, stop for signals, and crawl through yards. The S2 excelled at exactly one thing, sustained high-speed running, and failed at everything else. By 1949, severe turbine damage ended the experiment. The locomotive was scrapped in 1952, having logged just 103,000 miles before proving turbines belong in power plants, not on rails.
Number 4. No positive train control. In the 1950s, an engineer relied on wayside signals, timetables, and his own judgment to keep his trains safe from collision. If he missed a red signal due to fatigue, distraction, or sun glare, nothing stopped the train except physics and whatever was in its path. Human error led directly to catastrophe because no automated system existed to catch mistakes. Collisions between trains occupying the same track killed hundreds over the decades when signals were misread or ignored.
Norfolk and Western's John Henry earned its nickname from the legendary steel driving man who raced against a machine and won, only to die from the effort. The locomotive's fate proved grimly appropriate. Built by Baldwin Westinghouse in 1954, this steam turbine electric stretched 161 feet from coupler to coupler, making it the longest steam locomotive ever constructed. The boiler operated at 600 pounds per square inch, nearly double conventional pressure. The Pennsylvania Railroad S2 was supposed to prove that steam could outperform diesel at its own game. Baldwin and Westinghouse delivered this 686 direct drive turbine locomotive in 1944, and at high speeds, it performed magnificently. Above 40 miles per hour, the turbine consumed less fuel than conventional locomotives while delivering smooth, silent power. The problem was everything else. Below 40 miles per hour, the S2 became an engineering disaster.
Portable radios replaced visual signals between crew members. End-of-train devices replaced the caboose and the crew who rode in it. Dieselization eliminated the firemen who once shoveled coal. A 1982 presidential emergency board directed railroads to begin eliminating cabooses. By the mid-1980s, labor agreements had reduced crews to 2 or 3. The Federal Railroad Administration finalized a 2-person minimum crew requirement in April 2024, effective June 2024. Today, operating a freight train with fewer than 2 crew members requires special federal approval and must meet stringent safety requirements. The 5-man crew that defined 1950s railroading has been replaced by a legally mandated minimum of 2. Engineers sat exposed behind windshields that shattered on impact, and control stands that could impale them when the cab collapsed. Grade crossing accidents were particularly lethal because the cab took direct hits from highway vehicles with no protective barrier. The Association of American Railroads introduced its first crashworthiness standard, S580, in 1989, after high-profile crew fatalities. S580 specified stronger collision posts, anti-climbing devices, and improved short hood structures. The Federal Railroad Administration incorporated these requirements into federal regulations effective January 2009.
3 of these 106-foot monsters were built by Baldwin Westinghouse to prove that steam could compete with diesel on premier passenger runs. The coal-fired boiler fed steam to turbines which powered electric traction motors, an elegant hybrid that promised the best of both worlds. Instead, it delivered the worst of everything. Coal dust proved to be the M1's nemesis. The fine particles infiltrated the traction motors constantly, grinding away at windings and commutators. Crews reported motors burning out on nearly every run. The boiler controls proved temperamental, requiring constant adjustment to maintain proper steam pressure. Baldwin delivered number 700 in 1916, promising a locomotive capable of moving coal trains up steep Virginia grades without helper engines. The reality proved humiliating. Crews watched pressure gauges drop towards 0 within moments of opening the throttle. The rear engine set, mounted under the tender, lost traction as coal and water were consumed. Starting fully loaded, the tender provided excellent adhesion. Halfway up a grade with supplies depleted, the rear wheels would spin uselessly while the front engine sets strained to compensate. Who cut it apart and rebuilt it as two separate, conventional locomotives. Even the railroad's official designation XA acknowledged the experimental nature. The X stood for failure. Baldwin built the first triplex for the Erie Railroad in 1914, naming it the Matt H. Shea, after a beloved company engineer. The concept seemed logical. Put 3 complete engine sets on one locomotive frame, achieve unprecedented tractive effort, and eliminate the need for multiple helper engines on steep grades. The reality proved that some problems cannot be solved by simply adding more cylinders. The Matt H. Shea generated 160,000 pounds of tractive effort, more than any steam locomotive before or since. Between 1877 and 1887, 38% of all railworker accidents involved coupling operations. During the 8 years before federal regulation, the number of workers killed and injured equaled the total American railroad workforce in a single year. The Safety Appliance Act of 1893 mandated automatic couplers, specifically the Janney knuckle design, on all trains by 1900. Coupling accidents dropped from 11,000 in 1892 to 2,000 by 1902. The Lincoln pin had murdered thousands while politicians debated, and that's all, folks. These 20 banned locomotive technologies reveal how safety regulations transformed railroading from one of America's deadliest professions into a model of industrial safety. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future updates. Here's another video I've specially selected for you. See you next time.